As I mentioned, I've had a long couple days, so I don't have anything specifically from what we've been going over. I do have some stuff I was going to cover, but I'll tell you what, I am all about, I'm going to call it chasing rabbits. I don't feel like this one's really chasing a rabbit. I think this is answering a really good question. And so I do want to continue with, if John Arthur and you don't mind, right? Okay. If John Arthur and Ariel are good, we're gonna just kind of listen in on this, because it is important. John Arthur, before you finish your thought there, I think the one thing I would want to bring out, to ask, and you're probably going to get to this. Does the Bible support science, or does science support the Bible? I just want you to, John Arthur, go ahead and keep going.
Well, no, I mean, we can get to your lesson, and Eric,
Oh, I'm not worried about that.
You and I can.
Yep.
Talk about this after, unless you want to talk about it here. It's up to you.
Are you good?
I'm good.
Okay, go ahead.
So, where were we? I don't even remember where we were.
I'm sorry.
No.
It was the issue of science. You're honed in.
Well, okay, so basically, it seems to be like there's a little bit of people that support this young Earth thing, and they're very like, I don't know, I feel like any evidence that they see, they can just explain away.
Well, let's go back to what he said earlier, though, before we go any further.
Let's reframe that, actually, real quick. I want to reframe that. There's this new group of people who don't believe in God, and they've come up with a theory to explain what we've always understood as a created world. It's important to understand where the hypothesis of evolution came from. It came ultimately from Darwin, and then you started to see geological self-referencing to the quote-unquote fossil record, and it's really a worldview that is interpreting what we see in the landscape. So you've got these folks who don't believe in the Word of God, and they have a theory about the world as we see it to explain how it came to be without a God. I am more than open to listening to their theories and their hypotheses. That's fine. But the hypothesis has changed very, very often, and it started off with a world that was eternal. It's very Greco-Roman thought. And is actually a priest that came up with the idea of there had to be a big bang, a start. We always believed in the start of the world as Christians, especially as biblical literalists. We always believed that there was a start. But he believed that there was a start, and there was and to explain redshift in the stars, the way that light kind of shifts, there's a Doppler effect with light. You ever sit by a roadway and you hear beep, 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 and the horn gets, the waves get longer, right? So they start off higher pitch as they're coming towards you, and then they get longer as they get away from you. So the Doppler effect happens with light too. And so we look at how the stars were formed. Redshift is a part of how we say, look, there was a drastic expanse of the universe. So actually an evolutionist came along, not a Christian, says, oh, so what, you think there was this big bang and that's your theory? I've got to go back and look. I don't have every single person memorized, but yes, I can send it to you. And it was a pejorative, actually, at the theory, and eventually it became scientific consensus in the 60s. Ever since then, this theory or hypothesis about the Earth being, I think it was originally 4 or 6 billion years old, and it has the universe itself and it's now protracted out to 14 or even longer back. They've had to move it back for a number of reasons, because looking at the way that the geology of the Earth was formed doesn't fit. And that's why the theory or the hypothesis keeps changing.
But that's okay though if it changes, because that's how science works. You find new information, change your.
Let me change something out. Let me swap that out for you. I would say yes, you're correct, but there's a group of people who went onto the board for us. Always said the world had a start. There's a group of people said that you don't have biogenesis with flies and maggots magically spawning in jars. The belief of Darwin and a lot of contemporaries was that if you had food in a jar, that maggots would biogenesis just appear. Spontaneous biogenesis. And this was the original theory of evolution. This is where this came from. When we started putting, okay, let's test that theory. Let's make it so that you can't lay any larvae in there. Let's put a screen over that and tamp it down. Of course, no larva ever biogenesis, but instead you had potentially even larvae being put on the attempting, to get in there, being put on the film, the cheesecloth. So that's where the theory started. After multiple debunkings. So, for example, and let me give you an example. I don't want to say there's tons and tons and not give you any. The most famous pictures that you've ever seen. Have you seen the ones where they have the embryos? They got the bird, they got the human, they got the pig, and the embryos they look just like each other. You seen those? Those were drawn in the 1850s, 1860s. They were immediately proved wrong, and they're still in evolution textbooks today. In high school, you will still see those. I bet you saw those in high school.
Wow. I'm not sure
So those have been debunked for over 100 years by actual science, by observational science. But those diagrams are still put out. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It's not some sort of fringe thing. There's a serious issue. And it has to do with your belief systems.
I
And
have a question.
shoot.
How come like the scientific consensus now is that the Earth is not eternal, even though like they don't want it, they want it to be eternal?
Because evidence, once we started to actually look at the stars and we saw that Doppler redshift, everything expanded at a phenomenal pace. Where we can see evidentially that there was a start to the cosmos in some sort of far-flung. There's evidence to suggest that it all started in one place and was sprawled out.
But what I'm saying is they were okay with accepting that, and like that's now the scientific consensus.
Well, they weren't okay with accepting it. They had to accept it or commit intellectual suicide.
Right.
And most people who are in the know about, for example, that one Lucy is another great one, where it's a mixture of bones of different animals to create a missing link. Okay.
People but Lucy's not the only one, right?
No, there's many.
No, what I'm saying, there was other fossils found of her same like species. It wasn't just her.
No.
Yeah.
No.
There was.
So no. If you actually look at each one of those, you have like the Peking man is a mixture of a boar's jaw and a human skull. You look at Lucy, same thing. There's a number of issues, especially whenever you are looking at bones in the ground. You are making assumptions about what that individual or creature looked like, and that's fine. That's part of science. I'm not complaining, but you have to do your due diligence. And these pop up, and then every time they get washed away, like that whale, for example. It's really an aquatic mammal. There is no blowhole on the Septolopolis. What was the name of that? I can't remember the name of that.
I'm sorry.
But there's no blowhole, which would have been, in an evolutionary standard and understanding, the blowhole is the breathing apparatus. That wouldn't have evolved until after the animal had two and was on land and then eventually gone away. So by all accounts, it looks like it was an aquatic mammal. So there are extinct species. There are mix-ups with bones, and I'll be very kind and say that it's a misunderstanding. There are some cases where some of these missing links look like forgeries or frauds. By the way, it happens all across the board. Okay, there's a lot of and I wouldn't say forgery as much. There's very few, and I wouldn't say forgery as much as some of them, yes, but some of them I suspect there's good intentions, and I'm not here to claim villains where just a simple lack of understanding comes out afterward that, oh, sorry, that was a boar's jaw, and that's just not accurate. So
But one question I would have for you regarding this, what would the motivation be for evolution?
What do you mean the motivation? No,
What?
wait, can I just want to ask one question? No,
Yeah.
because there was, okay, so these atheists who believed in an eternal world, they eventually saw the evidence to believe that no, it was a created, there's a beginning, and so now that's the scientific consensus.
same with biogenesis.
My point is that if this young earth thing, if there's a lot of evidence, I'm sure that they would say, okay, this is it, if they really saw it.
Let me ask you a question. Why would a secular humanist become a young earth creationist?
I mean, why would a
Why
secular humanist who believes in an eternal universe believe in, oh, there's a start?
Well, there's a huge disconnect in the worldview issue. So someone who believes in evolution because it's part of their secular humanist worldview, I'm talking about them specifically, not theistic evolutionists, okay? But someone who has an attachment to that because they are denying God, different
That was the key
situation,
phrase right there.
they're going to format a different, understanding, or they'll come to know God. And by the way, there are a lot of people who change their opinion about God and they quit academia.
I mean, but does a young earth necessarily mean that there's God?
A young earth definitely means that it didn't
It's been
happen
all
by
over.
accident.
But,
it's at very minimum a guided process, a
really
creation.
disgusting.
There's no room for an evolutionary process
Way of
if the
wording
world
this
is only
acceptance of
6,000 years old or
science.
8,000 years old, right?
How does it
But I
reconcile?
feel
So
like
you have to change your worldview.
But same thing with like, I feel like a lot of people say,
She's more on
since the world,
the
the universe was
evolution
created, that
side.
implies there's a God
In-
who's created things don't just come out of nothing.
Seems to be
And that,
pretty well
that's
entrenched there.
William Lane
She's
Craig's like
asking
most common
questions on
argument
that because
is that, created
John
things
Arthur
have
bringing up points
creators,
about,
and that
well,
this
what
creator
about
was
the
timeless,
creation
spaceless,
side?
personal, and things like that.
That's
So that was
really
a
what
really
it's
big, like,
boiled down to.
what is it? Success for Christians,
It's not
because
bad.
it like gave
I
them
haven't-
a lot of evidence for God.
It hasn't watered its
And
bed
so
today, which is
if
good,
the
so.
scientists were just like, no, we just have
It's
an
getting
agenda,
better.
why would they be accepting of it?
Secular humanist.
But you're saying it's the consensus of the scientific community now that the universe was created. And so what I'm saying is that they were willing to accept the evidence, regardless of like, oh, it implies a God.
Well,
So
so
then
which is a smaller jump?
I
A
mean,
jump from okay, so we have a creation event. We can plot that back 4 billion years or 16 or whatever,
Right.
which is a bigger jump, that but it's still in their framework, or changing religions.
It's still a jump,
It's not a very big jump.
but it still is a jump.
Very small jump by comparison to changing your religion.
Wait, I don't understand what you mean changing your religion.
So
He's talking
becoming a
about the
secular
difference
humanist
between, right,
versus a
Christian.
Christian, a biblical literalist.
What does a secular humanist really believe?
That the world came about by natural processes.
Oh, no.
That they don't want.
Not only, there you go. That's the key. It's that. And then in John Arthur went exactly where I wanted to. At the end of the day, how did we get here?
By God, right? God created.
So if you start there, now you can start to see where you should be tracking. The whole issue of the secular humanists in science is to what? Deny God.
I feel like most of them are just like they just want to be right.
No.
Their scientific
No,
findings.
they want to be right about not having to answer to a God.
Well, I would be careful. I would say one's an extrapolation. So you can be a theistic evolutionist over here, and so what I'm trying to make sure that we just keep our terms very, very specific. Okay, so trying to be as precise as possible. But what Charlie and I are trying to speak to is if you have, let's say that the motivator isn't truth in this one case, but rather there's an extra motivator. There is a running from the idea that if the evidence leans towards a young Earth, let me reframe this real quick, just total reframe. Let's hypothetically say this, that we come out with a time machine and we go back and let's say that there is a young Earth creation, reality. What would that mean for the folks in academia who are secular humanists?
That they're wrong.
What do you think that they would say? What do you think that their reaction might be? Some of them. Some I think would fall on their knees and say, God, you're God. Okay, so I want to take those people out of the equation. Okay, let's take all of the people who are good faith and good hearted and they're responsive to the
Video?
Lord.
Is the video going?
You
Miss
good?
Nikki's not getting the video.
She's
She's having a hard time hearing. So here's what I'm going to do.
The camera's on.
No, it's not, bud. You got to turn that on.
Yeah, it is.
Well, she's gonna have to listen in on YouTube.
I'm going to let you, since you're doing a majority of the talking.
Well, that wasn't the intent, but
No. It's okay.
okay.
I'm good.
But coming from academia, I would say that those scientists, even, and especially the secular humanist ones, would be very excited about such an event because it means they get to publish a lot of papers.
Oh, I
really
agree.
fast and very high impact papers. They'd be really happy about it.
I agree.
I don't think they'd be upset.
I think that there would definitely be, though, an immediate splintering of the explanation, right? Especially if there was no direct evidence of God. I think some people would say there is a God. Now the question comes, which one?
Yep.
So if you want to run down the hypothetical just for a moment, which hypotheticals tend to be useless, but let's play with it for just another 10 seconds. Then you'd have a whole bunch of people who would be coming up with naturalistic explanations for what we saw. I mean, tell me I'm wrong. You would have some people saying supernatural and some people coming up with naturalistic explanations for even that. You'd have both. And so even in that hypothetical, I think Jonathan and I are on the same page. You would even have people splintering off into different sects of, here's how it could have happened naturally. There are people in this world, believe it or not, who do hate God. And I want to make sure we keep the Venn diagram very clear. That's not theistic evolutionists. That's not what I'm saying. Just to be super, super clear. But I would say that there's two things. If you want to frame it from the perspective of why are there all these people who are unscientific and they are a fringe group and they don't know, evolution is the new kid on the block. And it was originally formed under the idea that, like I said, rotting fruit in a jar would biogenesis flies. Now, I know that that's not the current hypothesis. I understand that. It has evolved from that once we proved that biogenesis is not possible. It's not a, let me rephrase that. At the very minimum, it's not an everyday observable occurrence. At the time, it was believed to be. So now we have an issue of how did that biogenesis happen, right? And so through naturalistic causes, I would say it's impossible. Just statistically speaking, and from the perspective of have we ever witnessed it? We haven't. Now you have a lot of secular humanists coming along. I didn't say evolutionists, secular humanists coming along and saying that that really we were seed planted from another star system somewhere far away, right? So there's the alien seed hypothesis.
That's a very fringe hypothesis. It really is. That's really.
It's
Like-
becoming more popular. I'm sorry.
No,
It's
but astrobiology really is, even as a field, is very fringe. Like, let alone that hypothesis.
I think it's going to become more infamous, but you and I can debate that. So I'm saying that that's one extent that people will go to, because biogenesis itself, if you could ever possibly create it in a lab, would be the holy grail for a lot of
Sorry, what
reasons.
exactly are you talking about? Abiogenesis? Or what are you talking
I'm talking about
So-
biogenesis. So
You
the
understand what biogenesis is?
inert, inorganic to organic life, and not just organic materials, but organic life, where you have a cell structure coming from something that was previously not living.
Life out of death.
And so the assumption is that you can create a carbon-based life form from the right mixture of pressure, whether in the depths of the ocean and with the heat of volcanic activity, whatever. Somehow you have a biogenesis, which we haven't witnessed. And so all of that to say, that's one view right here of the world that we live in. On the biology front alone, we kind of talked about geology earlier, but on the geology front alone, or the biology front alone, the biblical literalist interpretation, the young earth creation theory, is that the Noah's Ark was literal. There were a set of kinds. So you would have everything in Felidae, but also you would have probably some other creatures with one common ancestor.
I'm sorry, what is a kind? I'm still like confused on what it is.
So it would be a family or species somewhere in between there, okay? Because not every species lines up. Like there are species that can interbreed, and the Christian biblical literalist view would be that anything that could interbreed probably had a common ancestor that was more genetically robust. So say a species, if you will, but again, that's misleading because tigers and lions are different species, but they can interbreed,
So,
often with sterile results. So
like, how is that different? So, I'm sorry, can you explain like how is that different than
the evolution?
yeah.
Yeah. Here, do you mind if I grab a for Miss Nikki? Do you mind if I grab a marker?
Right here.
So, thank you. Heard you late. Okay, so here's the two theories, right? So you have a explosion of genetic information, okay? So, and then you have, I'm just gonna say cats, dogs, etc. Okay, so you have all of these kinds, right? You have oxes, you have this huge variety. Okay, but we're gonna say cat kind for the sake of simplicity. This will clear up in a minute. Okay.
Do you use cat and dog just because that's what we see?
These are simple, yeah, because these are simple. I'm just grabbing two things that are commonly available and easy to understand, that wolves and Canis familiaris don't necessarily breed well. They usually do, but then you've got some people who think that we might have actually had a common ancestor for Canis familiaris and the fox, Vulpes. What?
So like plants just one kind, or like how does that
Each individual plant type would be a kind. So you would have oaks and you would have probably pines in a different kind, because there's a lot of different kinds.
How does the kind taxonomy work for like microorganisms like bacteria, different bacteria?
Let me deal with these two, and I think it'll help a little bit. Let me deal with the simplicity. So this is creation event. Okay, sweet. So you have, boom, you have all of these kinds available. Then you have the flood, okay? So you've got an ark. Awesome. Now, post-ark, you're going to have cat kind. Say, we'll call this the common ancestor, okay? We'll mix our terms a little bit. Okay, so, and there's a reason I'm doing this. So just let me get through this, and I'll explain why I'd say that it's not unscientific to believe in a shorter Earth creation necessarily. There might be a difference in consensus. So you've got cats, you know, domestic cats.
What about hyenas? Where would hyenas be?
That's a good question. I'm going to deal with the two that I'm setting out to do because this is a little bit crazy. So let's go with lions. Okay.
Where'd they come from?
And then cheetahs. Okay. You get the idea. These are all genetic descendants of the cat kind that would have been on the ark. Okay, so that's the belief. In dogs. Okay, same thing. Wolves, domestic dogs, maybe foxes. Don't know. Question mark. Maybe. So these are all from the dog common ancestor. How about that? CA. So that's the creation view. So here you have the genesis of the Big Bang, sans God, or God derived, okay? But I'm going to go with the secular humanist just for a moment. Just for the moment, okay? Now you have this moment of biogenesis. Oops, cis, there we go. Okay, so you all of a sudden have a single cell. And this creature goes along, becomes, you know, algae. And I'm not going to get this 100% correctly. You now have insects, you know, plants. You've got apes, and you got humans, right? You got mammals somewhere in here, the general mammalian population. You've got, you know, all of that, then you've got humans, okay? Now, this is why I'd say this is where I have an issue with saying that this theory is less scientific than this theory, because we somehow got here, and we can debate what the evidence looks like, but what we haven't seen yet, I'll grant you, is biogenesis. We haven't seen this, and then we've never seen DNA structures that add. We've never seen a new set of DNA sequence add that, when passed down to its progeny, changes the progeny not into a sterile form or something with some sort of mutation that's harmful, but one that is neutral or better. It's always some sort of loss. Pardon my ugly helix there.
That's not true.
So,
So what is
So
it?
it's not always.
or a change.
Well, there are many mechanisms that will add genes to
Sure.
everything's offspring.
But the net, this is one example. The net of each one of those is sterility, disease, or some sort of failure.
Well,
To date.
If I go downstairs to the basketball court and I shoot 100, make 100 shots from the three-point line, on the net, I'm going to be missing, right? But, you know, if it's some kind of game, those scores, they count. They go on the scoreboard. So it's not like they never happen just because I missed it sometimes.
Let me ask you a different question. How do you feel about this on a times at least 2?
Let me,
Because you have to have past the plant side of things. Once you get to animals, you have to have a male and a female. Once you get past asexual reproduction, so you can make it a numbers game, but the numbers add up into the trillions of possibilities. So now we have a new theory
hold up.
that you just mirror this, 1 second, into a multiverse. That is the current theory, because we're living in the one multiverse.
No, that's, you know, so these multiverses, they're philosophy, they're not science. Their philosophy
I would agree with you.
There's nothing to substantiate any kind of hypothesis about any of these multiverse theories. These are interpretations of what we see in theory. They're interpretations of what we.
I've heard professor after professor out of Berkeley,
They're
out of
not-
Brown, all
they're
these
not-
others, they're
when they
referring.
talk about multiverse, they're not talking about scientific fact. They're not. They're talking about
I
their
agree.
personal philosophies.
I agree with you. But I would argue that both of these are personal philosophies applied to the same evidence, the evidentiary pool that we all have access to. This and this are both philosophies that we are applying because it can't be replicated. By its nature, it's sticky scientifically to get into. Would you concede that point? We can at least interpret what we see, but it's going to be affected by one of these two or some other worldview. But these are the common ones in our culture. So this is often used to excuse this. Thank you. That's all I want. I wanted to get to that.
Well, the one question I would have for Jonathan is, if we're talking about the 100 shots, is it generating another shot?
I think that's taking an analogy.
Well, no, but I do think it helps a little bit because you're looking at a force multiplier and also a single point of failure. So statistically, you're in a position where it's not statistically feasible. It's beyond what any statistician would say is impossible.
So why is it the science? I'm just wondering, why is it the scientific consensus if it's so like unbelievably like impossible? Like
Why was it the scientific consensus that the Earth was the center of the solar system? We come to new scientific consensuses.
yeah, because the church said so, and then that's
The
why
consensus-
they wanted to burn that guy or kill him because you're going into the church.
And all of the scientists
Well,
at
when
the
you say
time,
church, you're saying
Catholic Church,
Right, but
That's
but
not
all the
really
scientists at the time were involved in the Catholic Church. Like it or not, that's how it was. I think that those should be separate bodies for obvious reasons. But that was something that was quite common. Why do you think that we have an issue right now with, I don't know, the COVID vaccine? Now they're saying that it's not as effective as they said it was before, and there's a whole question on consensus. Consensus doesn't mean truth. It just
I like
means
that, I'm just wondering why. Like, why did so
you
many
like
people believe
stability. You like to have security. You like to know the truth, right?
it?
Me too. Me too. So we can start from there.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, the truth is, you can't even get from point 0 to point 1, though. If you bring the real science into it, that's what I was saying. Like, if you know the Gibbs free energy equation, and, if you know that equation, that's going to tell you that if I have chemicals just laying on top of each other, are they ever going to form into, some reactant?
Are you ever going to have biogenesis?
And the thing is, like, when you take a beginning chemistry class, they don't teach that part first. You do a bunch of stoichiometry where you're balancing equations and you just think all that stuff can happen, but they're just there for you to balance. But, usually you got to take a second chemistry course where they start teaching you about entropy, enthalpy, and they'll get into stuff like Gibbs free energy.
So
And a protein cannot be created, if you put the chemicals that make up a protein and you just leave them together, under no circumstances will they ever form a protein. Matter of fact, that process only goes one way. And we know this because if you have, I don't know what we have. We have just had Thanksgiving. If you leave a Thanksgiving turkey out, what's going to happen?
Okay.
It decays. And there's nothing you can do to that turkey to make it not decay. You can stick it in the fridge, and do you know the Gibbs free energy equation? Well, it's the change in the free energy is going to equal the change in enthalpy minus the temperature times the entropy. And the enthalpy and the entropy are just products of the chemical bonds that are already in there. So, I can slow down, because you see the T in the equation, the temperature, I can lower that. I can slow down that decay. Or I can add heat to it, and which, on a hot Texas day, when you got a couple days in between the trash and you have that Texas heat, what happens to that trash?
That's the same.
Oh my goodness.
So here's the thing.
It increases its rot power, but no matter, I can't affect the entropy or the enthalpy. because those are properties of the chemical bonds. All I can do is affect the temperature, and there's no temperature I can make where that process goes in the reverse direction.
So that equation is stochastic. Every single quantity in that equation is a statistical variable. So it's not impossible for it to go the opposite way. It's just statistically unlikely. So things like your evolution.
You're assuming another factor in the system to say that,
Well, how is that?
because you're going to have X amount of entropy or enthalpy. You have to have an additional added into the system if you're going to change that. You have to have an injection of some sort.
Not necessarily. So these things are statistical processes. Every quantity in the equation is a statistical variable. So it comes from the statistical mechanics that just over, say, the lifespan, the current age of the universe, according to the evolution history, 14 billion years, it's unlikely that you would have it ever happen the other way. But it's not impossible. It's just statistically unlikely. But something like
Well, you can use the
this-
car as an example.
Well,
If
hang
you
on.
have an
Well,
old
listen,
car
here's
that sits in
something
the driveway, it'll
something
rust, but it'll
like
never go back.
this evolution here, the quantity that's needed is many, many orders of magnitude lower than what you would need even in a single gram of water to see something counter to Gibbs free energy equation or any of the other thermodynamic or statistical mechanical equations. But something like this is ridiculously more simple than a system like that.
So you're
So-
saying things can improve.
I mean,
And
I really call the Gibbs, I call Gibbs
if the
free
numbers
energy
are
the
small
spin
enough,
equation.
then you might even see it. But if the numbers are very large, you won't expect to see it really ever.
so you're
Whoa,
saying it's
whoa,
more,
whoa.
you're saying with
You're
a large,
saying a microscopic change?
you're saying with a smaller data set, you're going to see it more often? Is that what I heard?
Yes, necessarily.
So
Even if that were possible though,
you would still, the first time it's witnessed, it's going to be a scientific miracle and discovery that everyone's going to point to, because it's part of, if you can have biogenesis, okay, that is the single greatest scientific discovery, because once you have biogenesis, you now have the ability, in theory, to carry that however far you want to go.
Well,
Right.
Not necessarily. So, small and large are relative terms. Something like this still is ridiculously complex of a system.
Yes.
So, in the theory, it takes billions of years to even see it once, even have a fraction of a chance of it happening once. So, it's not something that we'd ever see on some kind of human lifespan scale.
Or, well,
Well,
so
that becomes the
that's
question,
fine to
how many
say.
billions of years
Thank
do
you.
we have to work with?
yep,
That's why you have,
far
especially in
back do
pop
you go?
culture, maybe, I mean, I'm not gonna besmirch you, Jonathan, but I've heard many professors point to this as our ability to compromise the timeline, because it has to be longer than 14.
When they do that,
Statistically.
they're injecting the religion into the scientific
And I agree
discussion.
with
They're not
you.
discussing science.
And I agree with you.
And anytime a probability gets above 10 to the 15th, it's called absurd. It just means it does not happen by chance.
And we're well outside the scope of that. M- we're talking millions or billions of zeros to have this chain occur. And they're a stacked odds set. So the reason I brought this up, Ariel, you asked about kinds. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we talk about kinds. Does this make sense? So you'd have a cat kind. It's probably something that was genetically much more healthy than anything that's walking. Okay, and over time, interbreeding and geographical spatial limitations, you're going to have some critters that when they interbreed equals a sterile animal.
Where
Yeah.
are you getting like your information about the time? Is it like in the fossil record or?
So here's where we're getting the information on the kinds. That's a good question. That's a composite, just like the fossil record is. Okay, the interpretation of the fossil record goes one of two ways. You know, you have the Cambrian explosion, you have all of these composites of data sets, right? We call it the Cambrian explosion. Some folks believe that that's how it was deposited during the flood. Now, again, that's an oversimplification of the literalist interpretation. Okay, there's a lot of people who still have a lot of ink are much smarter than me on that, but those explanations do exist. The kind comes from A. The word comes from the Bible, the biblical understanding. B, a backwards extrapolation. If tigers and lions are interbreedable, did they probably have a common ancestor? Is that possible? If you, stay with me, if you do not believe that you had this offshoot, this jumping off point for each one of these, but rather there were kinds on the ark, right? So just extract from this for a second. Just pretend you don't believe this for 5 seconds, because I'm doing the same with you, okay? So pretend you don't believe this for a second, okay?
Well, I used to do
So
that.
so let's say that you believe that 2 animals were gathered by Noah, okay? Well, if they didn't evolve, which again, we never thought that they evolved before the 1800s, okay? There was the church's understanding for years. Well, we would have believed
What
that
was the
lions and
church's
tigers,
understanding? I'm sorry, what was the church's understanding?
that there was no evolution and that
Not
these were
even-
kinds.
Not even microevolution?
No.
No, microevolution, yes.
They believed in it?
Microevolution is natural selection, Charlie. Natural selection of genetic characters, character types, okay?
But
Just
was-
genetic expression.
So did the church believe in natural selection before Darwin, or was it after?
Mendelian genetics and all of that way presupposes Darwin, or predates Darwin. So yes, we believed in genetics and genetic expression. We did. So don't rabbit trail me 3 hops away.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
So
I was-
I'm trying to get this one done.
Okay, I'm
This
sorry.
one done. The only reason I stood up. Okay, so if you have lions and tigers, okay, so just follow me for 2 more seconds, okay? Lions and tigers are interbreedable, right? So in the Christian worldview, okay, let me rephrase that. In the biblical literalist worldview, it makes a lot of sense that there was probably fewer than more different species. You know, you wouldn't want duplicates on the ark. The ark is not that big. It's big, it's not that big. You would have to have common ancestors, okay? So lions and tigers are interbreedable. There's a chance, a significant chance, not 100%, that they came from the cat kind. You look at dogs, you look at some species underneath the Canis family, right? You're gonna find that there are some that breed well together and some don't. What does that fit well with? Our genetic laws and our genetic entropy. There you go. Genetic entropy. That fits within the laws that have established. If you have a gene pool, let's say God makes a perfect gene and it goes for 6,000 years. So God makes a genetic organism that is healthy and it's the way God intended it and it's working well. It means that it has a lot of genetic potential. There's a lot of biodiversity held in those genes. And you don't have cousins marrying each other. Does that make sense? Do you know why the Bible stopped saying marrying cousins?
Wait, I'm really-
Because if 2 cousins, 2 human cousins, marry, what happens to the kids?
they're inbred and they have all these like.
Physical deformities, mental problems. Okay, that comes, why does that happen?
Because there's not enough diversity. In the
Not enough genetic diversity. Does that help? So you've got a perfect gene set, right? The God's original blueprint. In the again, in the, I'm tripping over myself, the biblical literalist interpretation, you're looking at a set of genes that was capable of cousins marrying, even siblings marrying, okay?
So when did that?
God stopped that during the Exodus time frame. God said it's no longer acceptable. This is an abomination. The reason why it was an abomination, in all likelihood, was not the familial issue. It was the damage to the children. It's the main ick with that, is because you know that it's going to cause harm to the kids. So perfect genes would be genes that were capable of intersecting early on. Does that help?
Yeah, so the degradation of the genes happened after the fall, or just after Noah's flood?
Well, it would have by definition happened after the fall easily, and it would have been progressing ever since. So you would have had a high quality kind. So that kind, as almost there. Just let me finish this one thought. Sure.
Degradation create diversity.
It would create diversity of flaws.
Right. Problem with
A Down's child is more diverse than just you and I, and that's not a pejorative. That's a different kind, but it's not a good kind.
But the problem with interbreeding is that the defects present are magnified because of the lack of diversity. So wouldn't more diversity make breeding less a problem?
So reframe the question. I want to understand where you're coming from.
There's deformities as well in breeding, especially many generations along breeding, come from genetic defects already present in that small population.
Yep.
So
if you had
more degradation over time is what we're observing, and that's generating diversity. Shouldn't more degradation be something that allows inbreeding? So what?
I'm trying to figure out where you're going. I'm trying to understand it. So let me try to finish that question, and if I haven't answered your question, I want you to reframe one more time based on what I'm about to say. So, okay, so you understand how these could be from the cat kind. Let's talk about the dogs real quick. So let's say that somewhere off the line, potentially, this is a theory. Okay, this is a theory. It's or a hypothesis. It's as much as a hypothesis as this is. I'm going to admit this. Okay, so it's possible that Vulpes and Canis might have been in the same kind, because there is some potential for crossbreeding, but sterility. But there's a different set of chromosomes. So that would have been some sort of break in the genetic information. There would have been some sort of change way back when, if that's true. Don't know if it is. But let's go to the example of the French pit bull. You're familiar with that. About 150 years ago, we had a breed, the French pit. Can you breed those anymore without serious problems? They have been specifically inbred to the point where there is now damage. If they came from your domestic dog, your Canis familiaris, but now if you take a boy Frenchie and a girl Frenchie, and they don't equal a baby because they're sterile, this is a genetic dead end, right? So this is the long-term effect of genetic degradation. Just like lions and tigers.
That's artificial.
I agree. But you can also have natural bottlenecks in the genetic data. Darwin's finches were a very good example of genetic diversity within a certain population, picking out certain beak types and certain external characteristics that were suited for the food that was present on each one of those islands, right? That's microevolution or natural selection within a certain genetic population. New finches weren't created. You had some sort of master finch. That's a good question. It's worth looking at the fossil record. Okay, then you have X, Y, and Z. I would assume you would find something closer to this on the mainland. It would be my assumption. You'd probably have this in South America somewhere, okay? So this is probably your genetic population, but as these interbreed, you're going to have the same problem eventually as the Frenchie. Eventually, at some point, unless you have streams that cross and they aren't sterile, like the lion and the tiger are. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So eventually everyone will be sterile? Is that what you're saying?
Eventually, the genetic population is going to die. At least that is if you believe in genetic entropy. If you believe in genetic entropy, this is going to end. In fact, there's a great book. I cannot remember the name of it. Why Aren't We Dead 1,000 Times Over? I think. I can't remember the author. I've got to pull that back up. But they were doing research on the human gene pool. And the human genome is becoming dangerously close. We're seeing an increase. Now, of course, this could also be affected by vaccines or any number of toxins or pollutants, Monsanto, but there's evidence to suggest that there's damage to the human genome. So don't know which is true, what of those is true. I'm not anti-vax, by the way. You know, I'm fully vaccinated, whatever. But there's questions, right? There are questions about that. So all that to say, don't know if those are effects, but there are people who think that in about 1,000 years, the human population will cease to be as a population just because of this issue. It's a numbers game. So when I say perfect genes, I mean somewhere above Mr. Master Finch, way up here. This would have been the original God created kind. And then you'd have all of these subspecies, sub 2, sub 3, you get the point.
Let me make sure I get the point. So we're saying we start with one kind.
That's fine. One kind is fine.
Sure. We have some diversification, and then collapse to one kind again.
No, not a collapse, just a degradation and ceasing of the species eventually. If you put a mama rat and a daddy rat in a labyrinth and you feed them, eventually they'll stop populating. There's a behavioral issue, but there's also a genetic issue eventually.
So we have this diversification, and then all the branches, they don't come together again. They go extinct one by one, and then eventually there's one that lasts the longest, but it's done. Now we're populations.
I mean, yeah, and you would call this a time limitation on the universe, by the way.
Do I understand?
That just keep this going. Okay, so not just this one. Okay, so don't stop at the one, but eventually somewhere between these branches will die. You just keep going, and eventually somewhere down the line you're going to have genetic sets that are not feasible for a lack of sterility. Eventually that's basic genetics as we understand it right now. This fits under the kind model, and that's the biblical kind model. Take it however you will. But the biblical kind model, just to your response, Ariel, why is this so unscientific? Why don't people look at the science? This is scientifically observable. Would you agree that the theory that we had multiple kinds or ancestors, and we have a degradation of that over time, that's at least not unscientific in the sense of it's possible? Would you agree with that? Like from just that one core tenet of having a kind biologically?
Like there's a common ancestor?
Like there's a common ancestor for all the cats.
Yeah, I agree.
I have some difficulty with using the word degradation.
Okay, why?
Well, why is diversification?
It's not diversification on a genetic level.
Okay, so some mutations most mutations are harmful. Some
All known.
I was going to say, is there any that's good?
All known are either, so like sickle cell is the one that I always hear brought out. Sickle cell.
blue eyes or white skin.
So again, you can make that argument. I would argue that that's still within the genetic diversity of it. If you want to talk about the European hominids versus the African hominids, we're going to have a different conversation. I believe that those are all genetically derivative from one line. And again, that's my worldview talking, but I also don't think that God created 5 different species that interrelated. That originally came from the European Enlightenment. And that's how they did authorize the Nazis' execution of blacks and Jews. I'm not saying that you think that. I'm just saying that's part of the pseudoscience that they went after.
So that mutation of the eye color, that's a harmful mutation?
It's part of the genetic diversity, is what I would argue. If you want to talk about different groups across the, no, it's not a mutation. It's recessive.
That doesn't mean it's not a mutation just because recessive or dominant, but those ones make a difference.
Can have a conversation about that, but it is a gene expression. And I wouldn't say that blue eyes are necessarily a positive or a negative. I will say the lack of melanin is actually linked to a significant amount of ocular deterioration in old age. So it's possible that you could classify that in the negative. The more melanin you have in your pupil, in theory, the less likely you are. Is it cataracts or? Don't quote me on that, but there is actually some studies that blue eyes are more susceptible to degradation over time.
That is true, but light
So
skin
that would
is-
be a negative.
But something like light skin is more necessary for living at the polar extremes of the Earth,
Sure.
right? So someone of very dark complexion.
But you,
population of very dark complexion can have trouble living very far north, very far south. So,
But
white skin wouldn't necessarily be a degradation if.
but you and I haven't established that that's not within the genetic diversity. If you're starting, let me ask you something. Are you starting from 1, 2, or 3 different hominid races culminating in the current Homo sapiens sapien?
Let's assume that Adam and Eve were of darker complexion.
You're not answering my question.
Does
Is
say
it 1,
that's-
2, or 3?
One-
One point. Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify. And by the way, you can, out of a genetic superior, get blue eyes. It's Mendelian genetics. You can get that, and it can take generations, but it can still appear. Now, if you want to debate it about it being a mutation, I didn't grow wings when I came out of my
But I think,
mom's
like,
womb.
Are differences
It
in
is a
definition?
different. It is a difference with, if you want to debate that it's a negative difference or a neutral difference, I'll have a conversation with you about that. But there were no, the white skin being more adaptable to the darker wintry months, I would still argue is not necessarily any better than sickle cell anemia preventing someone in Africa from getting malaria. Because you could make the same argument. I would say it's at least a wash.
Like, I think like our difference in definition of mutation is why you're saying there have been no like evidence
Beneficial.
of a beneficial mutation.
No change in DNA that restructured a new organ, a new piece, a new part.
So that's recessive. I don't want to explain it to you. I'm sorry.
So I'll seed that it's either if it's a mutation, if I seed that, I would say that ultimately there are a number of things that you could put in the neutral or negative. You could put the polar months on a positive, but I would say that the scales balance. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a whale adapting bones to be able to walk on land in its fins. Do you understand what I mean when I say mutation, when I articulate it that way?
I saw some mutation that like it was a fly. Like instead of
Yep.
antennas, it had legs.
But ultimately, and again, I looked at some of those experiments in high school when I studied evolution, and went through the whole thing. By the way, AP student in anthropology and in science. So yeah, been there, done that. All of those mutations are not necessarily functional, and most are negative. Large set of that population is sterile, and very few, if any, pass on to the progeny, the children. So if it doesn't pass on to the progeny a positive trait, if it causes sterility, or if it causes disease, that would be my definition of not a positive.
But so many of those things are highly dependent on the environment that that population is in, right? So that
So
Even
adaptation
young-
through
even
natural
young
selection,
yeah, exactly. So even young Earth patients admit or believe in microevolution.
sure, natural selection.
You know, exactly. Natural selection leading to adaptation for a certain
The difference
environment.
is that we think that this is one closed genetic code on each one of these. If you pierce this, if you damage this, if you cut off information, you erase some, there are cases where sometimes that will ultimately benefit the individual in that space, but this doesn't grow to a larger body of information in mammals, for example. like, or just the next chain, you have a neg entropy run here. And so
Explain neg entropy. What does that mean?
negative entropy, reverse entropy.
Explain it, please.
So genetic entropy, right? Genetic entropy, you start off with a state with a set of genes that are capable of producing this tree, but eventually down the line over time, as time increases, more of these connections are made. There's genetic information that's ultimately lost. Down here, it might be in the whole, but it's very hard to squeeze all of that into one bottle again. It's entropy.
But it started in one bottle.
It started in one bottle.
So why couldn't you put that?
Well, can you, Ariel, your cousins, and a few other of Ariel's cousins all meet, and be very grotesque here, meet, marry, and have one kid? That would be putting it back in the bottle, right? That's not possible. What you would have in that case is you would have even more confusion on this. You can't put it all back into one, because you ultimately have lost information in the progeny.
I think if I ask more about this, I might derail where you're going with the previous thing. Oh, I want to talk about that.
I'm already derailed. So how does cutting off this? How does removing the antennae, for example, I'll use your example. How does removing the antennae from a fly and replacing it with two legs, which doesn't get passed on to the progeny? And almost all of those studies that I looked at, they were sterile. And the ones that weren't didn't pass on there was no genetic information change that was passed on. How does that go from the insect to some sort of common missing link between these two? That's my question.
With a lot of time, like it can go into.
No. I'm not asking how long it takes. I'm asking how does damage in utero or even while it's alive change, especially if its genetic information is not passed on? How does that add to a larger genetic code, or a completely different genetic code, one that you move, a couple of bits of that DNA and it's no longer a viable organism?
It's just other other mutations.
Doesn't explain how the one genetic, so we have one example, right, of a mutation.
Okay.
Follow me. So we've got Mr.
Because it's
Fly.
not just on one single.
So we've got just one, we got Mr. Fly here. Okay. So we got Mr. Fly. All right. And he normally has 6 legs and 2 antennae. But we're going to take these off and we're going to go ahead and we're going to put on 2 extra legs. Okay. Now, Mr. Fly doesn't have any kids
Okay.
because he's sterile, almost always. But let's,
Almost
for
always.
1 second, let's pretend that he finds another Mrs. Fly. It's not how it works, but I get it. Let's say that she's missing 1 wing. And she also has this character trait. Now, this is statistically very unlikely, but let's say that it happens.
Why is she missing the name?
We'll make her the same. I'm saying that none of these things happen. You take 50 flies, you subject them to the radiation, you do your study, your test. None of them look the same. They're all random. Any population would be random. But let's pretend that they have this and they have a baby, and baby in every example that we have has 2 antennae because the genetic code wasn't lost. If it's fertile, it's always, almost always going to pass on, especially when we're talking about limbs. Observational data, that's what I'm talking about. Observational data says if they're not sterile, they're going to pass this on with the 2 little antennae, looking just like Daddy did before we microwaved him. Now, if this baby does not have any of the new acquired traits, Do you see my problem?
It's just one instance though.
Maybe it's a recessive gene.
Maybe it's a recessive gene.
No, really. So take for example the real life example of there's a species of mosquito that lives in the subway in London,
Sure.
who cannot breed with any known species above ground, and genetic testing of them suggests ancestry from some above ground species. One in particular.
Something that looks like this. Yeah.
Yeah, something that looks like that. So the underground species of mosquito are a new species, right? So they were able to
In the human
offspring
taxonomy,
and things like that. So
that's why I say kind, because they're a derivative of this. You don't have a mosquito.
we're talking about flies.
Yeah, but you don't have a mosquito and a fly making a baby. You don't have a mosquito and a fly making a baby. You have a mosquito and a mosquito making babies within their own genetic subset.
So what's the kind of a mosquito?
So let me say it this way. If it breeds, it leads. I don't know. Like I don't have a catchy witticism for this. If it breeds, it's probably from a kind. Like it probably has a common ancestor. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But if it doesn't breed, it probably doesn't. Exceptions to the rule, like the fox over there, right? Like the fox looks like it'll breed with some animals and very rare dogs, rather, in some very rare instances, potentially. But again, it's sterile.
And it's like an innocent question. Like, how come it seems like the definition of kind is really big and not really very specific?
Because it's a common ancestor. Why is common ancestor so vague and not very specific? You haven't given me a single common ancestor.
What do you mean?
The definition is crystal clear common ancestor.
So I'm saying kind is a common ancestor of a certain family.
The scripture doesn't define kind.
It defines them as mateable animals. That's the definition in the scripture. Mateable animals of a specific subset. That's pretty much what I just said.
Well, except it doesn't.
Am I wrong?
It's just, reading through the
Sure.
Genesis account, it would also make sense to read it as mateable whose progeny are viable as well.
Oh, I would totally agree. Yeah.
But then why do we?
So I'm saying, I'm talking about right out of the creation. You don't have, we're not starting with the French pit.
Starting before the
We're starting up here
top.
at the top before the degradation started. So again, we're talking about how many years here? 6,000 for the entire timeline, right? Right, but I'm talking about just take one hat off, put the other one on. I've been doing it all night too. So let's just say in this hat we're 6,000 years, right? That's this hat. You wear this hat, you say, okay, if God created them healthy with a good genetic code and they're strong, they're not down here where they're no longer breedable. This is man-made. We did this. This is bad. This is man screwing it up. So you have these critters, which are dogs, cats, probably in the middle range of the size, like Adam and Eve would have probably been brown-skinned, olive eyes, maybe brown eyes, right? Somewhere in there, right? They would have been in the middle of the pack genetically. And they would have been the genetically, again, wearing this hat, they would have been genetically crafted perfectly. There's no sickle cell anemia. There's no Downs, right? Downs comes a lot later down the road. That wasn't meant to be a pun. So they're genetically firm and fit. So that's a kind. There's a common ancestor. Does that answer that question? We don't have it named because we haven't seen it, but we are looking at the evidence. Lions and tigers and cheetahs, oh my. Okay.
Evolution says there's common ancestors.
Not common ancestors, a single thread or a set of threads. We're saying that there is a set of species or family. And that's why I don't like using the word species, because the word species is a subset underneath, and you can take, it's a human term, which is fine. I have no problem with human terms. But this fits underneath a kind biblically. It'd be very hard to fit lions and tigers and cheetahs and all on an ark. And genetically, it doesn't look like that was the case if you believe that we are in a harsh genetic entropy.
Now, with all of that, it is able to. They have kept you from your school, which I deeply.
It's due Friday. It's fine. It's not due today.
You know what the most important thing to remember is? If you did a frequency distribution of topics talked about in the Bible, this is just under the tail. You know, the thing that's talked about the most, it's going to be the second coming of Christ. That's the absolute most talked about topic in the Bible. And then closely followed by your salvation as a close second. So, you know, spin what's that? Which one would you think God would want to talk about the most? His son being shamed, hung naked on a cross, and
Or his return.
or his return to glory and power, where you know he's going to present the kingdom to God the Father, and everything's going to be made right.
That's a
and-
really good thought. I wasn't thinking about that.
Let's go ahead and we'll pray and be dismissed. Lord, thank you so much for the time we've had and the discussion. Lord, I pray that you would help us to keep the right focus, to keep the proper things in front of us. Lord, we thank you for your word. Pray that you just bless the rest of this night, bless the rest of this week, please.
Sorry.
In Jesus' name, amen and amen.
Got my
Let's continue to hope for that. So, yeah.